Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual gallery talk with exhibiting artist Amanda Valdez. This is a program exclusively for our members and sponsors presented by the Heckscher Museum of Art, and we're so glad to have you all join us today. Thank you so much for your continuous and ongoing support of the museum, and welcome to our new people who are joining us today. I'm Caitlin Scher. I'm the development manager here at the museum, and I'll be your host for this evening. Joining me on screen are Heckscher Museum curator Carly Wurzelbacher. Excuse me, Carly, I always say your name wrong.
No worries.
And exhibiting artist Amanda Valdez. Amanda Valdez is a contemporary artist whose work has been exhibited in galleries and museums in Los Angeles, Miami, New York City, and Tokyo. Her work is represented in the collections of the Mead Art Museum at Amherst College, the Davis Museum at Wellesley College, and Amanda has been an artist in residence at 100 West Corsicana, Texas, the New Roots Foundation in Guatemala, and the Joan Mitchell Foundation in New Orleans, just to name a few. She holds an MFA from Hunter College and a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Amanda Valdez's piecework, currently on view at the Heckscher Museum through October 4th, showcases Amanda's brilliantly colored, patterned, embroidered, textured abstract paintings created by cutting, sewing, dyeing, painting, and embroidering canvas and other cloth. Following their conversation, our speakers will be responding to some of your questions, so please feel free to type any questions you might have at any time during the conversation in the Q&A box on your screen. Without any further ado, I'll now hand the program over to Carly and Amanda.
Thank you, Caitlin. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen here so that we have some images to look at. Okay, Amanda, can you see the screen?
I can.
Okay, so I think that means everyone else can too. So I wanted to start just by sharing this image because I wanted everyone, I think many people listening in today have been able to see the exhibition, which is great. For those of you who haven't, I wanted to share this image just so you get a sense of scale and a sense of the installation in the museum space. So that's why I wanted to open with this. But Amanda, to dive in, and just for those who are listening, I thought I would mention that Amanda and I are going to chat until about 6 o'clock, and maybe at that time is when we'll start fielding some questions from those listening in, which I'm really looking forward to. But I wanted to start, Amanda, with a discussion of color in your work and color more broadly. And so my first question to you is whether in your practice there are any writers or big ideas or concepts around color that have been foundational to you as you've developed your painting practice?
Yeah, so I would say that color has always come very intuitive to me, and I think we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. But in grad school as a painter, there's a must-stop book that everyone ends up getting their hands on, which is Chromophobia by the writer David Batchelor. And in it, he kind of outlines from a cultural theorist perspective, the way that, color has been used by Western society and colonialism to really devalue objects and culture and art, whether it's writing or painting, that are made by people other than Eurocentric Western culture. And so the authoritative nature of white kind of comes through in this kind of propaganda of basically being, threatened by the idea of color. And so in that, just thinking about, how is that achieved? And really there's two ways it's achieved is, color is a form of something from a foreign body. A woman, a person of color, LGBTQ. And then the other way is that to position it as superficial and position it as cosmetic, and so therefore insignificant. And all of this is a way to purge, devalue, diminish color. And so you know, as somebody who's always celebrated color, you know, when I found this cultural theorist in this book, you know, so much resonated, like, you know, in my own history of my relationship to color, but then also, you know, to understand that there's a broader kind of meta view of the way color actually has like real significance in what we value.
Right, and that reminds me of that dichotomy between color and line that kind of recurs throughout the history of art. So at different moments, color and line are seen as oppositional, where color is associated with the senses and with emotion and with feeling, and therefore with the feminine or the other. And line, you know, is sometimes viewed as more rational or intellectual. And so again, we get this tension between the two. So that's interesting to think about how that big idea of color has kind of played out over time and throughout history. I wonder if you could share more about your own experiences with color and your kind of lived experience with color, starting, you know, maybe even from the time when you were a child, or, you know, looking back to grad school again, or to today.
Yeah, I think if I look back, the moment I could tell that I had artistic sensibilities, because I wasn't a kid who could render anything they could see perfectly, and I think we're given the common misconception that that's what an artist is, you know. But if I look back, I was always interested in color, and it was always in, you know, girl culture with crafts and embroidery and making bracelets, and that I got the first buzz of understanding the power of color, that by putting different colors together, you could change them. And so every time I embarked on a new project, like, dealing with color was always the most exciting part of it to me. And, you know, as a young teenager, when I, you know, got into art more formally, you know, I knew that I had that in there. And so it kind of gave me confidence to move forward. And then, you know, through and through, I've always been a color junkie and unapologetic about it. And I still love the way that I can shift and manipulate colors. And I think it's a very painterly pursuit to try to make an ugly color beautiful and a beautiful color ugly. I know that I see that a lot in other painters, and it's always exciting to see little situations that people figured out. And while I was in undergrad, to have a more formal experience of color, I did take the like very traditional Joseph Albers color theory class, you know, with one of the much older tenured professors at the Art Institute of Chicago, whose parents had studied with Hans Hofmann. So she knew color through and through. And you basically have to buy these like $100 color aid packs, which is like 500 sheets of color. And you do all these color experiments, and you really delve into, you know, how do you change color, and what is colors function next to one another when you're dealing with value, hue, you know, etc. So I did kind of shore up, you know, a bit more of a historical, theoretical approach to color as well, beyond just my own kind of intuitive drive.
Okay. That's amazing. 500 sheets of color. That sounds awesome. You also make me want to like search under my bed or in my closet at my parents' house for those bracelets, because I know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, it was actually finding my box of embroidery when I was home, like one summer from college, you know, and I brought it back with me, and it kind of hung out for a little while. And then, you know, that is why I brought embroidery into the work, you know, and I brought it in a very different way than I was using it as a child, you know, thinking about it as how can I draw on the surface of a painting with this material? How can I get it to function differently than we know it historically to be, which is needle points and kind of precious craft, domestic spaces, you know, that it occupies. But again, it was like, you know, going back to the, you know, 10-year-old version of myself.
That's amazing. I wanted to move to this next image on the screen to ask you about, and the answer could be no, but whether when you are composing your images, if you're thinking about the subjective or emotional or affective properties of color. And I wanted to show this image. I'm talking about Honey Badger, which is the larger painting on the screen.
Carly, it didn't switch on my screen.
Oh, okay.
Maybe for other people.
Let's see, thank you. Sharing, here we go. Did that do anything?
No, I'm still seeing my sister.
Okay. Oh, really? Okay, shoot. Let me stop and restart just a moment.
There we go.
Okay, good. Okay, so when we were talking about color, I had wanted to show this. Do you see the salon style?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so sorry. Would have been helpful to see this when we were talking about color and embroidery. But what I wanted to talk about then was color in Honey Badger. So I hope now you can see the larger painting on the screen. Okay, so when I stand in front of this painting and I particularly look at that large yellow rounded shape in the middle, there's something about that color of that yellow that I find very meditative and calming, and it makes me want to exhale. And I wonder if, is that an interpretation that you're open to? Is that a response that you're considering when you're making your work? Or does that not enter into your thought process?
It definitely does. I think as I'm making a painting, whether it's a piece like Honey Badger, which has multiple elements to it, or it's a piece which kind of has like a singular bold shape, maybe within it has more action going on. I'm always thinking about how things are in relationship to one another. And I'm also very interested in my own lived experience of how paradoxes really like run my life in a lot of ways. Two things that seem to be incompatible or couldn't be true at the same time definitely are. And so, I think that, like for a piece like Honey Badger, I needed that big piece of fabric, which I hand dyed to get to that specific type of a yellow. I needed it to just be quiet because it was so big, because it was so central, and I was going to hem it in with these two kind of architectural elements that were more chaotic and putting more pressure on it. And so how do you show something and how do you imbue, a certain like emotional resonance, for a viewer? So hearing that you're having a like actual physical response to the painting is for me one of my ultimate goals. I really enjoy the moments when I can see a viewer with my work and I see them like do weird things with their bodies sometimes that they maybe are consciously or subconsciously, having reactions to. But yeah, I think for me, color can really set the tone of a painting. And with abstraction, that's what I'm trying to do. Like, I don't want to tell somebody how to experience my work or what the content is, because then I am immediately authoring who my viewer is. And I want my work to have the possibility to communicate with as many people as possible. And so it's like those subtle things about color is where I can kind of like get in to a viewer, get into their body, and maybe have them feel some recollection or experience or a somatic knowledge of our own, bodies come into play with their read of the work.
Mm-hmm. Right, this yellow shape in the middle, like pushing out against those columns, makes me want to like elbow something.
Yeah.
Talking about hand dyeing fabric leads me into something else I wanted to ask you about. And it's something that I really appreciate about your work. And I hope now you can see 9-patch tannin. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we've touched on this a little bit with craft already today, but my sense is that sometimes we privilege talking about craft and the handmade, and with your work, the quilting patterns are so amazing. It's easy to get caught up and focus only on this idea of craft or the homespun, and to really romanticize that notion. What I have always found interesting about your work is that you do not shy away from these other aspects of textiles, like machine-made textiles, and that you incorporate store-bought, commercially sourced fabrics into your work. And so the image on the screen is composed both of hand-dyed fabric and of commercially sourced, machine-made and colored fabric. So I wonder if you could share more about what you're looking for when you are, going into a store or sourcing machine-made woven fabric for your work. Like, what draws you in, or what are you looking for, and maybe what do you not want?
Yeah, so there's kind of two approaches I have when I go to one of the fabric shops in the garment district here in New York. And it's either I have a piece in mind, like I already have the drawing, I know what's happening with certain aspects of, the shapes, like, okay, I want paint in this part, but I want fabric in this part, and I want it to be like this, or I want quilted section in this shape. And then there's other times where I just feel like the fabric that I have in my studio, is getting stale. So I'll just go, looking and buy things without a set piece in mind. But oftentimes it's the first. And so, to me, it's always like color and the durability of the fabric. Like I really need something that's strong. I don't typically use a lot of like silks in my fabric. There are some silks that are strong and I've used those, but I'm typically using like different types of colored denim or stretch cottons. And so there's something about the weave or the color and the way that it's sitting on the surface of the fabric. And I've really kind of narrowed down like what part of the fabric stores I engage with. I learned early on as I was experimenting with painting and fiber and textiles kind of coming together that there was really a lot that I did not want to bring into the work. And so the type of fabrics that I was experimenting with in the beginning brought their own content to my paintings that I quickly realized was not something I was interested in. So if I started using upholstery fabrics, well, suddenly I'm talking about the domestic space, or I'm talking about class. If I'm using something that's highly patterned, well, there's some other artist who made that pattern. So is it fashionable? That's not something I'm interested in engaging with. And so there are times I really have to like push away from that. Even certain colors become fashionable, and I have to pay attention to some of the trends to make sure that I try to keep away. But again, like printed fabrics, I'm not interested in whatever content comes with them. The different types of fabrics that have specific uses, not interested in them.
Now that you say that, I see that. I see the absence of that in your work. And I think it would be really hard to find fabrics that are not preloaded with those ideas about class or usage, or even like a period. Like I could imagine like colors that are like very 70s or a print very 60s. And
yeah,
I think it must be actually really hard to find something that's,
well, thankfully, I live in New York City. And before that, I was in Chicago, which actually has amazing fabric stores. But, the times where I've done residencies where I'm not near amazing fabrics, it's a real struggle when I go to kind of a craft store. I won't even use like plain colored quilting cotton, because even those colors remark on a certain type of cultural production that I'm not interested in. And so, which we could transition into a discussion of the hand dyed.
Sure. Let me see. So I'll just show this as another example of quilting in your work. And then this is a good example, I think, of a hand dyed fabric. If you're seeing recrudescence.
Yep.
Okay. So when you are hand dyeing, how did that come about, and what, does that require different mental processes, different physical processes, different tools? Like how did introducing hand-dyed fabric impact your work?
Yeah, I had been, oftentimes my studio practice, I feel like I have questions kind of hovering over me, and I'm contemplating maybe how to approach those questions. And the idea of like, how can I get even further into the surface of a painting? So, I'm doing a lot of cutting and sewing of the surface before it's even stretched, manipulating it, engineering it. But I wanted to get even further in, and I've approached weaving as the solution to that, but that's been a very slow burn in my studio, and I'm not quick to just, put something in that's not fully developed into the painting. So as that's been like brewing, and it's a bit more of a cumbersome challenge to take on, the idea of I could get into the fabric, that I didn't have to go all the way to the warp and weft, but that I could start dyeing, and I could teach myself how to kind of create a whole lexicon of these natural hand-dyed colors. So when I was at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans for a residency there, I was there for a month, and I decided that I wasn't going to put a lot of pressure on myself to produce. Like, I didn't need to have a ton of, finished paintings out of this time period, but that I needed to take the time to experiment. I needed to take the time to onboard a new skill. And so I started, with just getting different books that had, kind of the technical ABCs of what to do, and, acquired the materials, burners, big pots, all these kinds of things, and then started taking copious notes. It's a very scientific pursuit, which is not typically what's going on in my studio. And so, to dye fabric, it's like a 2-day process just to prepare the fabric. So you kind of have to scrub them of whatever kind of chemical production, industrial residue they have on them. And then you have to prepare the fabrics to receive the dye. So they need to be in vats with different chemicals, and then you get to dye, which is really fun, using different raw materials. Sometimes I'm using like different barks, and so you boil off these barks and then strain them, and you have like the most beautiful Osage orange yellow color. There are other times where it's all powderized or it's liquefied, and so you get that fabric in, and then through a process of experimentation, you're understanding how long to leave something, what happens when you over dye, and bring in 2 different dye vats with a single piece of fabric. And then also, there's small things you can do, like maybe I don't dissolve the material all the way, because then I'm going to get little variations of the color as the fabric comes into contact with the raw material, instead of just a purely diluted material.
Okay, so even experimenting with a traditional dyeing practice, or experimenting, like I would imagine other people who are dyeing fabric want a very uniform.
Completely. So maybe when I'm doing some of the setup for 2 days, they say not to overcrowd your vats, because you want the fabric to be able to move around and really receive the chemicals evenly. Well, maybe I might, crowd that, because then you're going to get a lot more variation. Like this piece of fabric that we're looking at, that is what I did. And so you get all this weird color undulation, and that's where, the fabric has been in this like wet chemical vat, kind of all crunched together. And so all those folds and seams are kind of, well, not seam, folds, they're taking that, the prep chemicals differently. So then when you put it in the vat, it's going to naturally respond differently.
Incredibly, we only have a few more minutes before we take questions.
Wow.
We could talk for hours more. So I wanted to finish by asking you about something you've touched on, which is the role of residencies and research and travel, and how that informs your work. And you shared with me in advance some images.
Yes.
I'm just gonna, shall I scroll through all of them quickly? Or
yeah, go for it.
Okay, so let me just show these. And so Amanda, my question to you is, what role have these residencies and travel played in your work and the trajectory of your paintings? And just tell me if you want me to navigate to any of the things we've just seen.
Yeah, let's go back. One more. Okay, so this is, yeah, we'll stay at Gee's Bend. So, since I left grad school, I was prepared before I left grad school to know that, like, if I was going to make this artist thing work, like, I really had to make it work. So I was ready with trying to understand how I could be supported. And artist residencies kind of came on my radar. I was actually able to go to one while I was still in grad school for one of the summers I had off. But it's an amazing way to get support, and it's an amazing way to get away from your life, be immersed in your work. And, in that phase, as I was like going from student to emerging artist, you have a job and you're like trying to make it all work, but then all of a sudden you get to go away for 3 months and you get to make this just amazing body of work and an incredible amount of work that then can kind of be your passport when you come home, whether it's in shows or have visits with people. And then also what happens is, with all that concentrated time in a residency, I can find new places. I can mine, all this work. When I then get back home for a period of time, I'm like supercharged. Maybe something new's come into the work, oil stick-on mounted paper, the second time I went to the Joan Mitchell Center, or the quilting came in when I was at the Bemis Center in Omaha, Nebraska. And so, if I'd never kind of put myself in new positions, I wouldn't find those new questions I referenced earlier. I wouldn't be able to, engage in the resources of these communities. And for me, I do a lot of research that doesn't necessarily enter my work in a didactic way, but it's another part of me that's just like driving this whole ship, And so whether I'm like researching for 2 years, like pagan iconography and Renaissance art, or I'm looking at, different parts of textile history, I believe that it's kind of all going in and then it kind of organically comes out. This is one of my favorite moments, that when I was at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans and looking at, where could I start to go experience some of the quilting culture of the South, and I was very aware of Gee's Bend, which, if you're not aware, it's spelled GEE''S, Bend. Please Google, you'll be blown away. And I realized that I could drive 5 hours and go to the co-op, that it's still there. And, for all the success that they've had, and their work is beautiful. And a lot of the quilters have, moved on to other places, but their collective is still there and they're still working and making, it's still just 2 double wide trailers in the middle of nowhere. And so I was able to acquire this little itty bitty quilt, which is very cherished. So even just getting to go experience history, it was really important for me to like understand, where they were located, because their location is so much a part of their oppression. And, from the end of slavery to the civil rights movement, really understanding, trying to understand a little bit more this very specific moment of American history and culture.
Wonderful, thank you. Maybe in fielding some of the questions, we'll be able to return to some of the other images that we have here. So I wonder if we should ask Caitlin to join us again, and there she is.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. It's been fascinating, and we're so grateful to hear from you both. So as Carly just mentioned, we'll field some questions from our audience. So Amanda, the first question is, what artists have influenced you?
Oh my gosh, so many at so many different points of time. I would say that very early on, my mom had taken me to San Francisco when we were looking at art schools, and coming into contact with their museum has a huge abstract expressionist collection. And kind of having the first moment of realizing that you could make art that wasn't representing like a thing that existed in the world was a huge moment for me, like as a young artist. And so I kind of like just devoured that, whether it was Robert Motherwell or, Lee Krasner, like all these artists that I wasn't aware of, like as a high school art student. You're looking at Picasso and Matisse and these kind of, Frida Kahlo, these like titans of 20th century art. But then I would say, for me, I consider myself a painter, but there's so much more work I'm interested in. So I do look at a lot of performance art, like Anna Teresa de Kersmaker. She's a choreographer who has like this very rigorous, precise dance style that really lodges itself when I get to view her work inside of me. But then there's also artists like Sheila Hicks, and seeing her work and how she took textile and fiber and weaving, and she has weavings that you would consider like, this is a weaving, but she also took it into sculpture, and seeing the kind of ramifications of that. As like a lot of people since the Venice Biennale show that showed the Hilma af Klint paintings, and then we had the big show at the Guggenheim this last year, seeing her work and understanding how she predates the kind of traditional timeline of abstraction as invented by like white male Europeans. She predated them. So that's been like a huge reckoning to see her work. And then again, like anonymous quilters that I find at antique stores, they still, they influence my work, and I get excited by that.
So we have two questions that relate to the same topic. So one of our viewers is curious about how you choose the title for your work. Do you assemble the piece with the title in mind, or does it come after the work is completed?
That's great. So I thank you for the questions. I keep a running list of words that I think could make titles. So whether it's like weird sentiments that pop into my head as I'm thinking about things, or sometimes at the end of a season, I'll sit down and write a list, just kind of like open word associations of what has kind of happened in that season. So like at the end of summer, at the end of fall, and today's a solstice, so it's kind of like appropriate to talk about that. And typically I don't have a title in mind, like while I'm making it. It kind of is something that is a process that happens after the piece is finished. And for me, it's also, a title is a way, within abstraction to try to like give a little poetic nod to, and open up a little bit some meaning for the viewer in a very slight way.
Great. Our next question, do you purposefully ground your works on the bottom edge in a manner to reference sculpture or to reference an object occupying space?
Yeah, I think it's a reference to our bodies. I think it's a reference to our physical experiences. I've never been able to just kind of have them floating there and feel like they make sense. Even in my drawings, I draw in a frame before I start making the drawing, so that I assert some type of a more firm edge than just the edge of the paper. And with the painting, that the edge of a painting is an actual physical edge. There's like a 2-inch width to the painting typically, so that kind of exists there. But yeah, for me, I feel like I want the somatic experiences of my body to come out in the works, because I want them to connect with the somatic experiences of your body. And so in that way, they always kind of end up grounded.
Our next question is, there has been discussion of color and craft, but this person is also curious about the origins or references of the forms and shapes that you use in your paintings.
So all of my work starts from drawing, and it's this way that I feel like I can get at this internalized, I kind of referenced it in the last question a bit, that we have all these experiences, physical, emotional, psychological, as we are living our lives, and they kind of get lodged in our bodies, not necessarily our brain. And so it's in drawing that I really feel like I can think through my hands, that I can get at this aquifer of experiences and dislodge these shapes. And sometimes I feel like I completely understand where my shapes come from, and then other times they stay deeply mysterious to me, and I'm okay with that. And even that can like affect the titling. Because there are times where I'm like, oh, I totally know where this came from and this needs that title. And so, you know, once that drawing happens, I then decide if it's going to be a painting and how should I construct that painting. And then that can influence, you know, the shapes even further. It's funny to see the image on the screen because there's so many of them. It's like a little army. And so, you know, to me, it's all coming from the body.
We have another person who is curious about your process. They want to know if your canvases are lying flat as you sew and weave onto them. Are they on a table? Are they on the floor? Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so if there's fabric in the piece, which, you know, I try not to be formulaic. So some pieces have fabric, some don't. Some have embroidery, some don't. Some have oil sticks, some don't, which this is a great slide to be looking at for that. But, you know, if I'm sewing, you know, the frame's not even in the picture yet. Everything's kind of loose. If I'm working on a big piece and I'm trying to sew a shape in, I lay it out on a piece of plastic on the ground so that no dirt gets on it. And then I like pin the shape in for a little bit. And then I take it to my sewing machine and sew that part. Then I lay everything flat again and I pin a section and take it to my sewing machine. All the kind of nooks and crannies of a shape I have to go in by hand and sew. And so then, you know, after the surface is constructed with fabric and canvas, then it's stretched. And if it's a small piece and it's going to have embroidery, it can usually exist on the table, you know, and I can work on it, you know, kind of half on the table, half off, so I can get to the backside as I'm embroidering. But the big pieces are like an epic pursuit, you know, to keep sane when I'm embroidering for 4 days straight, you know, 8 to 10 hours a day. And it's a big piece and my hands can't reach, I have to go to the front of the surface, and it's usually propped up on the wall, you know, up off the ground on some chairs. And I have to go to the front of the surface, put the needle in, go around to the back, pull the needle out, and then hold the embroidery as it's moving so it keeps nice and straight. And then I have to go back and poke in the back and go to the front and pull it out. So it's very physical. You know, at that point, it's up against the wall. When I'm doing the oil stick, it's a mix. Like, to prepare the paper on the surface, it has to all be flat. But then once I'm doing the oil stick, if it's a smaller piece, I might work, so I'm like looking over it. If it's a large piece, I have it up, you know, up against a wall or on the wall, and I'm working at it that way. So it kind of just changes depending on the size of the work.
And I'll just jump in for a minute to say this is a good example in 9-patch where you can see Amanda was sewing all this, you know, in her lap or on the machine, and only at the end does it get stretched around the frame of a painting stretcher. And that's when the seams start to pull and you get this, you know, it gives a little bit of life to this grid.
Yeah.
So we have another question. What influences weight into the size of a finished piece?
What was the last part? Weighs into the what?
The size of a finished piece.
Okay, yeah. And also, these are so many great questions. Thank you to everyone who's here sending in great questions. So oftentimes I would say like 75% of the time I'm working towards some type of exhibition, like a solo exhibition. So, you know, I may have some understanding of the space the work's going to exist in. And, you know, I want there to be different sizes, you know, within an exhibition so that different experiences can happen, something more intimate on a smaller piece, something kind of more epic on a larger piece. And so as I'm making my drawings, you know, they really determine like what's possible. So sometimes like a drawing that's very minimal might want to be really big because I'm going to do something complex in it. You know, and sometimes something that's very complex in the drawing, and actually this is like a great slide because the piece on the left that we're looking at, you know, is a relatively like simple shape, but then the way I brought the materials in, I kind of kept making each section a little bit more complex. So that top part of the top triangle is 3 different colors of fabric sewn into one another and then sewn into the piece. And then the bottom triangle, I created 2 different types of embroidery within it, and at 2 different like lines kind of coming together. And then there's all the frenetic oil stick. And so, you know, I wanted for all that action to kind of like keep it all really tight and together. But then, you know, the piece on the right, Honey Badger, you know, as Carly was kind of eloquently describing her own experience with that piece, like you're not sometimes going to be able to get like an overwhelming sense of some type of emotion, you know, if it's not kind of competing with your own body or taking over your body, or inviting you in a different type of way. And so, you know, usually there's kind of things percolating, you know, in the studio as I'm like making drawings and deciding what should be paintings. And then from there, kind of, they start talking to me and telling me, you know, what they want to do.
So I think we have time for one more question. So Amanda, the museum's Long Island's best juried exhibition of high school student work is also on view at the museum currently. And I know some of the students may be in the audience today. What advice would you give an aspiring artist? And can you speak more about how you got where you are today professionally?
Oh my God, extend the time of this Zoom talk. No, okay, so if I had to boil it down, when I went, I'll just be really frank. When I went to undergrad, you know, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I didn't necessarily see that like level of education in my future at certain points, you know, as a teenager per se. And to have the opportunity to go there, I just felt like it was this huge gift. So my joke, you know, for those years that I was married to school. And, you know, as like simple as it sounds, it's just, you have to just work really, really hard. You know, like I left the first art school I went to because it wasn't challenging enough, you know, and then I lived for a couple years doing my own thing. And then I went back to school. And so, you know, I just took that education as like such a gift. It was not a given. And I think that that perspective like really helped me try to get as much as I could out of every situation. And then, you know, just for me, you know, I kind of alluded to that period of when you're done with grad school and like really being ready to like jump off. And the summer before I went into grad school, I created like a whole database on opportunities that I could apply for either in grad school or right after grad school. And so that, you know, that I would try as hard as I could to set myself up for success. You know, I've never made a backup plan. So this thing has to work out. I'm not independently wealthy, which is totally fine. So this thing has to work out. So it's always just pushed me to try and like find every opportunity that I can at the appropriate moments of my career. And so, you know, I think if you look at artists who are 5 to 10 years ahead of you and study what they're doing, and then try to see if any of that makes sense for yourself. That's what I did. I looked at artists who were 5 to 10 years ahead of me. I like cruised all their CVs. What's this residency? What are residencies? Oh, wow. Okay. So I made a database of residencies. What are grants? Which grants would apply for me? And made those databases. But, you know, like I just studied what people were doing ahead of me.
That's great advice. Thank you. So again, thank you so much, Carly and Amanda, for sharing your insights. Amanda, it's been a pleasure hearing about your work. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. And as a reminder, Amanda Valdez piecework is on view at the Heckscher Museum through October 4th. Please visit heckscher.org for more information on how to visit and for more photos and educational content related to this exhibition. Thank you, everyone. Stay well.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks so much.